It's great to see everyone out this evening, and let me just say how blessed I am to be able to stand before you and to share a portion of God's Word with you as well this morning. So today I'd like to present a topic that I found very interesting while studying it, and I think that looking at these people today will help us in our walk with God and become better servants for God as well. So today we'll be talking about faithful young men in the Bible. I have 8 different examples laid out for us today that serve as a godly example of what we are supposed to do in different scenarios in life. So the first one I thought of was Joseph. I think the first thing we see when it comes to Joseph is the many obstacles that plagued him during his younger life. From being betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, being thrown into prison on false claims, and all the while staying faithful to God. So let's read about how God rewarded Joseph for his faithfulness. Let's go to Genesis chapter 41. Genesis chapter 41, and we'll start in verse 37. The proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants, and he said to them, "Can we find anyone like this, a man who has God's Spirit in him?" So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one as discerning and as wise as you are. You will be over my house, and all my people will obey your commands. Only I as king will be greater than you." Pharaoh also said to Joseph, "See, I am placing you over all the land of Egypt." Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, clothed him with fine linen garments, and placed a gold chain around his neck. He had Joseph ride in his second chariot, and servants call out before him, "Make way." So he placed him over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and no one will be able to raise his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt without your permission." Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphnath-Paneah, and he gave him a wife, Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. And Joseph went throughout all the land of Egypt. As we can see in verse 38, even Pharaoh, who was an Egyptian, knew that Joseph was a man of God. Just like Joseph, we too can be an example to unbelievers. And Jesus commands us to do so in Matthew chapter 5. So let's turn over there. Matthew chapter 5, and we'll start in verse 14. "You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. No one lights a lamp and puts it under a basket, rather on a lampstand, and gives light to all who are in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven." Just as Joseph made Pharaoh see that he embodied the Spirit of God, we too can make others see we walk a different, more fulfilling path than those who are in the world. The second person I thought of was Samuel. Even from a young age, Samuel displayed the ability to be faithful for God. Let's go to 1 Samuel chapter 3. 1 Samuel chapter 3, and we'll start in verse 2. One day Eli, whose eyesight was failing, was lying in his usual place. Before the lamp of God had gone out, Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was located. Then the Lord called Samuel, and he answered, "Here I am." And he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." "I didn't call," Eli replied. "Go back and lie down." So he went and lay down. Once again the Lord called Samuel. Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." "I didn't call you, my son," he replied. "Go back and lie down." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, because the word of the Lord had not been revealed to him. Once again, for a third time, the Lord called Samuel, and he got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." Then Eli understood that the Lord was calling the boy, and he told Samuel, "Go and lie down. If he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. The Lord came, stood there, and called as before, "Samuel, Samuel." Samuel responded, "Speak, your servant is listening." The Lord said to Samuel, "I am about to do something in Israel that will cause everyone who hears about it to shudder. On that day I will carry out against Eli everything I said about his family from beginning to end. I told him that I am going to judge his family forever because of the iniquity he knows about. His sons are cursing God, and he has not stopped them. Therefore I have sworn to Eli's family, the iniquity of Eli's family will never be wiped out by either sacrifice or offering." Samuel lay down until the morning. Then he opened up the doors of the Lord's house. He was afraid to tell Eli the vision, but Eli called him and said, "Samuel, my son." "Here I am," answered Samuel. "What was the message he gave you?" Eli asked, "Don't hide it from me. May God punish you and do so severely if you hide anything from me that he told you." Samuel told him everything. He did not hide anything from him. And Eli responded, "He is the Lord. Let him do what he thinks is good." So let's really take a look at verse 15, where it says that Samuel was afraid to tell Eli what God had told him because he knew the message would make him upset and worried about him. Samuel may have feared Eli's reaction to God's message, but that still not stopped Samuel from delivering this message anyways. Jesus tells us as well that we will have to bring uncomfortable messages to the people around us. Matthew 10, verse 34 through 36 says, "Don't assume that I came to bring peace on the earth. I did not come to bring peace but a sword. For I came to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies will be the members of his household." In the end, saving a soul is more important than someone else's feelings. So the third person I have here is David. So we're going to look at a very familiar story within the life of David, which is his battle with Goliath. Instead of looking at the battle, let's focus more on David's attitude leading up to this famous battle with Goliath. So let's go to 1 Samuel chapter 17. 1 Samuel 17, and we'll be starting in verse 20. So David got up early in the morning, left the flock with someone to keep it, loaded up, and set out as Jesse had charged him. He arrived at the perimeter of the camp as the army was marching out to its battle formation, shouting their battle cry. Israel and the Philistines had lined up in battle formation facing each other. David left his supplies in the care of the quartermaster and ran to the battle line. When he arrived, he asked his brothers how they were. While he was speaking with them, suddenly the champion named Goliath, the Philistine from Gath, came forward from the Philistine battle line and shouted his usual words, which David heard. When all the Israelite men saw Goliath, they retreated from him, terrified. Previously, an Israelite man had declared, "Do you see this man who's coming out? He comes to defy Israel. The king will make the man who kills him very rich and will give him his daughter. The king will also make the family of that man's father exempt from paying taxes in Israel." David spoke to the men who were standing with him. "What will be done for the man who kills that Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Just who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" David's attitude that we see in verse 26 is the same one we should have when the enemies of God try to slander him and his people. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15 through 17 says, "But in your hearts regard Christ the Lord as holy, ready at any time to give a defense to anyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do this with gentleness and reverence, keeping a clear conscience, so that when you are accused, those who disparage your good conduct in Christ will be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil." This passage emphasizes the importance of maintaining a holy demeanor and defending one's faith, even when faced with adversity. We need to be ready to defend our faith no matter what is thrown our way. Let's go back to 1 Samuel 17, and we'll pick up in verse 28. David's oldest brother, Eliab, listened as he spoke to the men, and he became angry with him. "Why did you come down here?" he asked. "Who did you leave those few sheep with in the wilderness? I know your arrogance and your evil heart. You came down here to see the battle." "What have I done now?" protested David. "It was just a question." Then he turned from those beside to the others in front of him and asked about the offer. People gave him the same answer as before. We see here that in these verses that David's older brother is trying to undermine what David is saying by attempting to discourage him. Sometimes discouragement or betrayal might come from the people we care most about. There are numerous examples of people being discouraged by their family or friends in the Bible. Demas betrayed Paul. 2 Timothy 4 verse 10 says, "Because Demas has deserted me, since he loved this present world and has gone to Thessalonica." Job was betrayed by his friends, and in Job chapter 4 we see what they say the reason is for these tragedies he went through. Job 4, 7 through 8 says, "Consider, who has perished when he was innocent? Where have the honest been destroyed? In my experience, those who plow justice and those who sow trouble reap the same." Absalom betrayed David. David experienced betrayal by his loved ones more times than he could count. Let's go to 2 Samuel chapter 15. 2 Samuel chapter 15, and we'll start in verse 10. Then Absalom sent agents throughout the tribe of Israel with this message: when you hear the sound of the ram's horn, you are to say, Absalom has become king in Hebron. 200 men from Jerusalem went with Absalom. They had been invited and were going innocently, for they did not know the whole situation. While he was offering sacrifices, Absalom sent for David's advisor, Ahithophel, the Gilonite, from the city of Gilo. So the conspiracy grew, and the people supporting Absalom continued to increase. Then an informer came to David and reported, the hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom. David said to all the servants with him in Jerusalem, get up, we have to flee, or we will not escape from Absalom. Leave quickly, or he will overtake us quickly, heap disaster on us, and strike the city with the edge of the sword. The king's servants said to the king, whatever my lord the king decides, we are your servants. Then the king set out, and his entire household followed him. But he left behind 10 concubines to take care of the palace. So the king set out, and all the people followed him, and they stopped at the last house. Even Jesus experienced great betrayal at the hands of someone he deeply cared for. Let's go to Luke chapter 22. Luke chapter 22, and we'll read verse 47 and 48. While he was still speaking, suddenly a mob came, and one of the 12 named Judas was leading them. He came near Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus said to him, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? The reason betrayal hurts so bad is because it never comes from the hand of an enemy. This is why we must always be on our guard, because we do not know when or where Satan will try to bring us down with discouragement. So the fourth young man I was thinking about was Solomon. It is agreed by most secular historians that Solomon was roughly 20 to 25 years old when he became king in Israel. Let's take a look at a conversation that Solomon had with God at the beginning of his reign. Let's go back to the Old Testament in 1 Kings chapter 3. 1 Kings chapter 3, and we're going to start in verse 4. The king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there because it was the most famous high place. He offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream at night. God said, ask, what should I give you? And Solomon replied, you've shown great and faithful love to your servant, my father David, because he walked before you in faithfulness, righteousness, and integrity. You've continued this great and faithful love for him by giving him a son to sit on his throne, as it is this day. Lord my God, you have now made your servant king in my father David's place. I am just a youth with no experience in leadership. Your servant is among your people. You have chosen a people too many to be numbered or counted. So give your servant a receptive heart to judge your people and to discern what is good, and discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours? Now it pleased the Lord that Solomon had requested this. So God said to him, because you have requested this and did not ask for long life or riches for yourself or the death of your enemies, but you asked for discernment for yourself to administer justice, I will therefore do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has never been anyone like you before and never will be again. In addition, I will give you what you did not ask for, both riches and honor, so that no king will be equal during your entire life. If you walk in my ways and keep my statutes and commands, just as your father David did, I will give you a long life. Then Solomon woke up and realized that it had been a dream. He went to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the Lord's covenant and offered burnt offerings and fellowship offerings that he had held for a feast for all his servants. To show this kind of self-control and discipline at such a young age is truly remarkable. Me personally, being in the same age group as Solomon was around this time, I would have been very tempted to ask for one of the other options, such as riches or destruction of my enemies. But Solomon shows us how irrelevant these things are when compared to obtaining the wisdom of God. Just like Solomon did, we too should be asking for wisdom. James chapter 1 and verse 5 says, now if any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives to all generously and ungrudgingly, and it will be given to him. In the book of Proverbs, I think we can get a glimpse of Solomon's inner thoughts and why he asked God for wisdom here. Proverbs 8 and verse 11 says, for wisdom is better than rubies, and all the things one may desire cannot be compared with her. God's wisdom is something we should place great value on and should always be seeking in our lives. So the fifth young man we have here is Josiah. Josiah was another king in Israel that we can see was faithful in his youth. So let's go read about an incident that happened when Josiah was just 26 years old and how he handled it. Let's go to 2 Kings chapter 22. 2 Kings chapter 22, we'll start in verse 8. The high priest Hilkiah told the court secretary Shaphan, I have found the book of the law in the Lord's temple, and he gave it to the book to Shaphan, who read it. The court secretary Shaphan went to the king and reported, Your servant has emptied out the silver that was found in the temple, and have given to those doing the work, those who oversee the Lord's temple. Then the court secretary Shaphan told the king, The priest Hilkiah has given me a book, and Shaphan read it in the presence of the king. When the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his clothes. In this passage, we see that Hilkiah the high priest finds the book of the law and has it read in front of the king. Josiah becomes very upset because he realizes that he and the people are not following God's law the way that they should be. Let's pick back up in verse 12. Then he commanded the priest Hilkiah, Ahikam son of Shaphan, Akbor son of Micaiah, the court secretary Shaphan, and the king's servant Asaiah, Go and inquire of the Lord for me, for the people and for all Judah, about the words of this book that has been found. For great is the Lord's wrath that is kindled against us, because our ancestors have not obeyed the words of this book in order to do everything written about us. Josiah then tells Hilkiah and a few others to go and ask God about the issue of them not obeying the word of God and what they're supposed to do. But we see that Josiah does not stop here with his concern about the situation. Josiah takes action to resolve the problem. He destroys all the idols and everything not pertaining to God, and he implements all the holy days back in practice in Israel. I think there's a 3-step process that Josiah follows, and I believe is one we can deploy whenever we discover sin in our lives. So the first thing is we must recognize that we have sin in our life and that it needs to be corrected. I think David is a good example of this when he expresses his realization of his sin with Bathsheba in the book of Psalms. Psalms 51 and verse 4 says, Against you alone I have sinned and done this evil in your sight. Sir, you are right when you pass sentence. You are blameless when you judge. If we were to ever start the process of repentance, we must be able to recognize that we have done wrong. Secondly, we need to ask God how to handle the problem of sin and study about it as well. We saw what Josiah did once he recognized there was a problem he and his people had. He immediately sent to ask hold of the prophetess what must be done to right the wrongs they have committed. We too as Christians need to ask for God's help through prayer when faced with the problem. Philippians 4 and verse 6 says, Don't worry about anything, but in everything, through prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. Mark 11 and verse 24 says, Therefore I tell you, everything you pray for and ask for, believe that you have received, and it will be yours. Lastly, we need to take action like Josiah did. Josiah got rid of every single thing in Israel that may have tempted him or his people to sin. Jesus commands that we must do the same thing in our lives if we are to be saved. Let's go to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, and we'll start in verse 29. If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. For it is better you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Just like King Josiah, we must purge our life out of everything that would cause us to stumble or to sin. Absolutely nothing on this earth is worth going to hell for. So the next one I have here is Daniel. Similar to Joseph, Daniel seemed to have all the reasons to not be faithful to God from a worldly perspective. It seemed that Daniel's God had forsaken him by letting him be led away into a foreign land and having to watch his home be destroyed. However, this is false. God had not forsaken Daniel, and Daniel had not forgotten God either. We can see this in the very beginning of his story in Daniel chapter 1. So let's turn over there. Daniel chapter 1, and we'll start in verse 8. Daniel chapter 1 and verse 8. Daniel determined that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine he drank. So he asked permission from the chief eunuch to not defile himself. God had granted Daniel kindness and compassion from the chief eunuch, yet he said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and drink. What if he sees your face looking thinner than the young men your age? You would endanger my life with the king. So Daniel said to the guard whom the chief eunuch had assigned to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then examine our appearance and the appearance of the young men who are eating the king's food, and deal with your servants based on what you see. He agreed with them about this and tested them for 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, they looked better and healthier than all the young men who were eating the king's food. So the guard continued to remove their food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. God gave these 4 young men knowledge and understanding and every kind of literature and wisdom. Daniel also understood visions and dreams of every kind. At the end of the time that the king had said to present them, the chief eunuch presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king interviewed them, and among all of them no one was found equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they began to attend to the king, and every matter of wisdom and understanding that the king consulted them about. He found them 10 times better than the magicians and mediums in his entire kingdom. Daniel remained there until his first year at King Cyrus. So for a little background of this story right here, we see that Nebuchadnezzar had his chief eunuch train some young men from Israel to teach them in the ways of the Babylonians and make them fit to serve the king. However, Daniel, being a Jew, could not eat the meat that the king set before him because it would defile him according to Jewish law. We see that in this passage, the strong conviction that Daniel had when faced with this trial. Even though Daniel had the support of his 3 friends, it still takes a lot of courage to be the one to speak out against things that society finds normal. Other passages in the Bible encourage us to do the same as well. Peter gives us some great insight when it comes to going against the grain of society and speaking the truth, and also what the world will think about you when you take different positions on different things and act differently than they do. Let's go to 1 Peter chapter 4. First Peter chapter 4, and we'll start in verse 3. For there has already been enough time spent in doing what the Gentiles choose to do, carrying on an unrestrained behavior, evil desires, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and lawless idolatries. They are surprised that you don't join them in the same flood of wild living, and they slander you. Back in the story of Daniel that we're analyzing this morning, I think that the eunuch probably thought that Daniel and his friends were either weird or strange for asking him that if they didn't have to eat the same food as everyone else. If I had to guess that the other young men that were training with them probably treated them differently than everyone else did. Who knows, they may have even been mocked or ridiculed by others for this. But in verse 15 of this chapter, we see that Daniel and his friends appear to be healthier than their peers. We all see throughout the book of Daniel that God consistently rewards Daniel over his entire life with wisdom and understanding. A good job high up in the most powerful kingdom on earth at the time, and King Nebuchadnezzar favored Daniel way more than his own Babylonian magicians and astrologers. Just as God rewarded Daniel, God will reward us for our faithfulness too. Let's go to Matthew chapter 16. Matthew 16, we'll read verse 27. For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will reward each according to what he has done. In the same book of Matthew, let's skip over to chapter 25. We'll start in verse 31 over there. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them one from another, just as shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right hand and the goats on the left. Then the king will say to those on his right, Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me. We are blessed by God in this life, and we will be blessed by God in the end, as long as we do what we are supposed to be doing. So next young man I had on this list was Timothy. When we look at Timothy this morning, I want to look at less about Timothy himself and more about what and who made Timothy so faithful and zealous for God. So what or who exactly made Timothy such a good worker for God? Every single Christian spiritual journey starts with having a good role model. If the young people of the church have no one to teach them or to set a good example, how are they expected to be faithful? Timothy had plenty of good influences around him. 2 Timothy 1 and verse 5 says, "When I call to remembrance the genuine faith that is in you, which dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and I am persuaded is in you also." Timothy had the influence of his mother and grandmother to help guide him in his spiritual journey. We know this influence has been even from since he was very, very young. 2 Timothy 3 and verse 14 through 15 says, "But you must continue in the things which you have learned and been assured of, knowing from whom you have learned them, and that from childhood you have known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith which is in Christ Jesus." Spiritual training needs to start very early in life to ensure that faithful Christians are made so that God's work may continue. Proverbs 22 and verse 6 says, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old he will not depart from it." Even Paul had a big influence on Timothy and went so far as to call him his son in 1 Timothy 1 and verse 2. From my personal experience, I've had many positive influences in my spiritual walk so far. It takes entire congregations to teach the next generation how to love and fear God and how to continue the work of the church. So lastly, the last young man I want to look at is a story about young Jesus that can help us in our spiritual journey. Let's go to Luke chapter 2. Luke chapter 2, and we'll start in verse 41. Every year his parents traveled to Jerusalem for the Passover festival. When he was 12 years old, they went up according to the custom of the festival. After those days were over, as they were returning, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents did not know it. Assuming he was in the traveling party, they went a day's journey. They began looking for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all those who heard him were astounded at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." "Why were you searching for me?" he asked them. "Didn't you know that it was necessary for me to be in my father's house?" But they did not understand what he said to them. From this passage, let's really focus on the only statement that Jesus makes here. Jesus asked his parents, "Did you not know I must be about my Father's business?" We too, as followers of Christ, must be about our Father's business in everything that we do. Colossians 3:23 says, "And whatever you do, do it heartily as for the Lord and not to men." We must be constantly striving to be better and to do God's work so we can bring others to him and save their souls. The main point of this lesson this morning has been about two characteristics all of these young men showed, which is perseverance and resilience. All these young men, despite lacking experience and wisdom of age, showed extreme moral conviction and faithfulness for how young they were. We should all strive to have the same conviction these young men had when it comes to serving God. If you desire to have this kind of conviction for the Lord, or perhaps you once did, but have seemed to have wandered away from Jesus, we ask that you come forward and make that right as we stand and as we sing.